In 1986, a chartered plane lifted out of London carrying a medical crew and one passenger, an actress whose stroke had stolen half her mobility and who needed to reach a specialist in the United States. She never booked it. Frank Sinatra did, a man who divorced her in 1957, remarried twice afterward, and by that point counted a decade into a marriage with somebody else entirely. Scroll past any thumbnail of those two staring at each other in black and white, and you already know the sentence that plane exists to prove. She never recovered from him. That line travels everywhere, through retrospectives and tribute reels and comment sections, where somebody always turns up to explain that they simply do not make love like that anymore. And the shape of it flatters every party involved. Most beautiful woman in the world, ruined by a singer, 33 years of exile and cigarettes and regret in a London flat, then pneumonia at 67 with his name on her lips. People started selling that version before her funeral. The version carries one structural weakness, and sentiment plays no part in it. Arithmetic does. Gardner and Sinatra married in November 1951 and separated in October 1953, which grants the functioning marriage a lifespan of roughly 23 months, followed by nearly 4 more years of lawyers pushing paper across 2 continents. She outlived that marriage by more than 3 decades, and across them she collected 2 BAFTA nominations, moved countries twice, ran through relationships ranging from tabloid gold to violent, developed lupus, drank steadily enough that her body eventually presented the bill, and watched the studio machine that manufactured her stardom come apart from the inside. None of that fits on a thumbnail. The title deserves a test rather than a demolition. Sinatra mattered to her. That plane in 1986 proves it, and no honest account erases the loyalty behind the gesture. The question narrows to something more interesting than romance. Did one legal marriage, broken for longer than it ever functioned, explain the remaining 33 years of a woman's life? Or did somebody decide that story sold better than lupus, alcohol, a collapsing industry, a violent co-star, and a contract system that priced her body into a clause? Start in 1947 with a softball team. Before the romance, the sequence, they meet socially in 1947. Begin the affair in 1949, while Sinatra still belongs to his first wife, to Mary, on November 7th, 1951. Separate in October 1953, file for divorce in 1954, buy a house in Madrid in 1955, and collect the final decree in July 1957. Read that list twice. The marriage spent more of its official existence dissolving than functioning. Anybody who has sat through a slow divorce knows those middle years hold no romance whatsoever. They hold lawyers, property, taxes, and the particular misery of remaining legally attached to somebody who now lives on another continent. Gardner never lingered in Los Angeles waiting for a decree. She bought property abroad 2 years before the paperwork closed, which nobody could mistake for the behavior of a woman hovering beside a telephone and waiting for California to call. A second piece of accounting vanishes from the tragedy version, and it concerns money. The tabloid version kills her broke, a destitute recluse surviving on Sinatra's charity, which delivers a devastating final act and happens to be false. Probate valued her estate at roughly $200,000. Not a fortune by movie star standards, not the paperwork of a woman abandoned to starve either, and more than enough to sink the claim that she lived on handouts from an ex-husband. The myth also needs Sinatra himself to sit still, and he refused. He married the actress Mia Farrow in 1966 and divorced her in 1968, then married Barbara Marx in 1976 and stayed with her until he died. A story about 2 people frozen in unresolved love collapses the moment one of them keeps buying rings. If the paralysis ran both ways, somebody should tell his wives. They meet in 1947, socially, and the detail that survives from those early days involves a celebrity softball team Sinatra assembled, on which Gardner turned up as Batgirl. Whatever started there took 2 more years to become an affair. By the time it did, in 1949, he still belonged to Nancy Barbado. Gossip forms only part of why that arrangement mattered. Sinatra came out of a Catholic family and traded on a Catholic public image, and in 1949, the American press treated a married singer running around with an MGM contract actress as scandal rather than career strategy. Barbado existed outside the love story as a wife with a household, and the affair ran in public long enough for the entire country to form an opinion about it. Gardner, meanwhile, belonged to MGM in a way modern audiences underestimate. Biographer Lee Server built an entire book around the argument that the studio operated as an abusive employer rather than a fairy godmother, engineering her image, treating her private life as company property, and attaching penalties to any behavior it judged off message. She climbed out of poverty faster than most people can psychologically absorb, and the institution that lifted her expected a return on its investment. Two people, then, sharing almost nothing except fame and a talent for reaching the front page. Volatile turns up in every biography written about the marriage, and none of the biographers reaching for that word intended as a compliment, since the volatility arrived early and never left. The word earns its keep. Sinatra's divorce from Nancy Barbado closed at the end of October 1951, and he married Ava Gardner on November 7th, which leaves precisely 7 days between the end of one marriage and the beginning of the next. Not a year of respectful distance, not a discreet interval to let the press find another subject. Just 7 days between the collapse of a long Catholic marriage and a wedding to the woman the whole country already blamed for wrecking it. 2 readings of that timing survive, and both probably hold at once. Passion explains it, the kind that never consults a calendar. Convenience explains it too. 2 people who spent 2 years unable to appear in the same photograph, choosing the fastest available exit from scandal, which ran directly through a wedding. Neither reading describes a marriage entering a stable phase, and 23 months later they separated. October 1953 ends the household, and the woman who walks out of it refuses to go quiet. Gardner began a public affair with the Spanish matador, Luis Miguel Dominguín, and the word public carries the weight in that sentence, because nothing about the arrangement hid behind closed doors while she waited to learn whether her husband might call. The press covered it, and she let them. Inside the specific economy of 1950s, Hollywood, an affair with a bullfighter, announced the end of a marriage at maximum volume. She filed for divorce in 1954. The decree arrived in July 1957, 3 years later, which tells you how slowly these things crawled when 2 famous Catholics, 2 studios, and an ocean shared a single file. The tragedy version handles this stretch by skipping it. Dominguín rarely survives the tribute reels, and when he does survive, he arrives demoted to a rebound, a distraction, a man Gardner deployed to provoke jealousy in California, which conveniently folds every relationship she ever entered back into the one relationship the audience paid to hear about. Any man she touched after 1953 becomes evidence about a different man. That method produces something other than biography, a story with its ending already chosen, working backward to collect proof. She spent the divorce years abroad, in company and employed. The grieving widow version needs her parked somewhere else entirely, in a dark room in California, beside a telephone that never rings and a photograph she cannot put down. One piece of this marriage receives careless treatment nearly everywhere it surfaces, and it deserves care instead of a punchline. During the relationship, Gardner terminated 2 pregnancies. Her stated reasoning ran straight through her contract. MGM attached financial penalties to pregnancy, and a pregnant leading lady turned into an expensive problem for the studio that owned her schedule. Sinatra, raised Catholic, carried it as a wound that never closed. Some retellings convert this into a bonding moment, a shared sorrow welding 2 people together forever. The evidence points the opposite direction. Biographers describe the decision as hers, taken while the marriage already wobbled and while the studio held a financial gun to her career, and they describe the aftermath as a wedge between 2 people who agreed on neither what had happened nor who held the right to decide it. Grief never fused them, it cracked them. Sit with the mechanics for a second. A company wrote a clause into a contract, and that clause reached into a woman's body and helped end 2 pregnancies and 1 marriage. Server's description of MGM as an abusive employer functions as a finding rather than a flourish, and this episode supplies the receipt, signed by a legal department that never appears anywhere in the love story. Every time the internet retells the Gardner and Sinatra romance as doomed grand passion, this episode softens into tragic poetry when the machinery behind it ran contractual and completely unromantic. Studio contracts photograph badly in soft focus. They vanish from the edit, and the singer collects both the blame and the credit for a decision a legal department helped force. In 1955, with the divorce still unresolved, Gardner bought a home in Madrid. Consider what relocating cost a working actress under that system. Los Angeles held the offices, the meetings, and the informal machinery by which a career either continued or quietly died from inattention. Leaving carried professional risk, and she left anyway, 2 years before her marriage legally ended, while the man she married still occupied every headline that mentioned her name. People who never recover rarely buy real estate on another continent. They stay near the wound, close enough to reopen it whenever the mood strikes. Gardner chose a city with a different language and no MGM commissary, then stayed inside it for 13 years, long enough to watch the Hollywood she left behind rearrange itself without her. Some biographers call that running away, which sounds fair enough until you notice that running away still counts as a decision, and this particular decision placed roughly 9,000 kilometers between her and the man she supposedly could not live without. Distance like that requires upkeep, and she paid it every year until 1968. If the divorce destroyed her, somebody forgot to notify the awards juries. In 1959, she appeared in On the Beach and drew a BAFTA nomination, and in 1964, The Night of the Iguana earned her another BAFTA nomination plus a Golden Globe nomination for the same performance. Both arrived after the separation, both arrived after the decree, and both rank among the strongest work of her career according to people who study film rather than people who write captions. The tragedy version cannot digest that. A woman ruined by heartbreak in 1957 does not spend the following 7 years delivering performances. The British Academy notices twice. Kendra Bean and Anthony Uzorowski built their 2017 retrospective around exactly this correction, treating Gardner primarily as a screen actress with a body of work instead of a romantic casualty who happened to leave behind a filmography, none of which means the work arrived easily or that the industry treated her decently, because it did neither. The system that built her already showed cracks, the contract era approached its end, and parts for women over 40 in that period ran thin, bordering on theoretical. She kept working through all of it. 2 nominations in 5 years describe something other than a ghost. Notice how rarely those 2 films surface when this story circulates. A woman who supposedly lost everything in 1957 collected nominations on both sides of the Atlantic by 1964, and that inconvenient fact usually compresses into half a sentence about how she buried herself in work to escape the heartbreak. Work becomes therapy, achievement becomes symptom, and whatever she did next reroutes back to him. The trick suits anyone chasing a tidy arc and fails anyone trying to understand what her life actually contained. "1966 breaks the myth open, which may explain why almost nobody examines the year closely. Sinatra married Mia Farrow in 1966, and that marriage lasted until 1968. In the standard retelling, Gardner sits alone in Madrid absorbing news that her great love moved on, and the edit cuts to archival footage of a beautiful woman looking wistfully out of a window. She spent that year on a film set. Gardner worked on The Bible in the beginning, under director John Huston, and during production she entered a relationship with co-star George C. Scott that turned physically violent. No tabloid invented this. Huston described the set in his own memoir in 1980. Server documented the same events in the definitive modern biography, and the 2 accounts corroborate each other. Scott assaulted her. Take that in. In the exact year the internet pictures her pining over a wedding announcement in California, a man she worked with beat her on location while the production carried on around them. That trauma belongs to her alone. Sinatra caused none of it. No ex-husband appears anywhere in the sequence, and it sits in her biography as a separate injury with separate consequences. Yet most tellings drop it entirely, or grant it a single line at most, because a violent co-star ruins the shape of a love story built for a thumbnail. Sinatra never set foot on that location, though Huston did and Scott did, and so did she. Anyone hoping to understand why Ava Gardner's later years hardened should begin with 1966 rather than 1957. The math favors it. 24 years separate that film set from her death, and no retelling of those years can honestly leave the set out of the account, however inconvenient it proves for the romance. In 1968, she left Madrid for London, took a flat at Ennismore Gardens, and remained in that city for the rest of her life. The London years supplied nearly every image the myth runs on: the recluse, the drinking, the aging beauty in a European flat, the phone calls placed at strange hours. Each element contains some truth. The causes behind them splinter into pieces involving no singer in California whatsoever. Lupus, first, an autoimmune disease that damages the body unpredictably across years and cares nothing about who you used to marry. Chronic alcoholism, second, sustained across decades, with the physical bill that implies. The stroke in 1986 third, which took part of her mobility and returned none of it. Underneath all of it, the collapse of the studio system that manufactured her career, which stranded an entire generation of contract players without the machinery that once organized their working lives. Picture the practical side of that collapse. The contract system supplied scripts, publicity, schedules, doctors, and a payroll, and once it dissolved, the performers it raised inside it lost the only professional structure they ever knew. Younger actors adapted and hired agents who understood the new arithmetic. Gardner, by then living abroad and unwell, watched the work thin out. Server presses this argument directly and refuses to reduce her loneliness to a man. He points instead at the hard living, at the psychological cost of a rise out of poverty too fast to integrate, and at a personality that chose independence over comfort at nearly every opportunity. His Gardner survives an industry rather than perishing from a marriage. A genuinely sad version of her life exists without Sinatra in it. That version requires an autoimmune diagnosis, a bottle, and a body that stopped cooperating in 1986, and it arrives without any assistance from a man in California. Most of the quotes you have read about Gardner's supposed lifelong obsession trace back to one journalist and a set of late-night telephone calls. Peter Evans, a British reporter, interviewed her between 1988 and 1990, while she lived in poor health and short of money, and his portrait shows a woman circling back to Sinatra constantly, unable to leave the subject alone. That portrait reached the public in 2013. The title, Ava Gardner, The Secret Conversations, published 23 years after she died. Consider the position she occupied during those calls. A woman in her middle 60s, ill, drinking, watching her savings shrink, sitting up past midnight with a reporter who wanted the one subject guaranteed to sell a manuscript. Nobody arrives at that table as an equal party. She needed money. He needed a marriage to write about, and whatever emerged from those nights answers to both pressures rather than to some pure recollection finally surfacing after 30 years. Read that publication date again, slowly. 23 years after her death, assembled from Evans's own notes, without her authorization, and without any ability on her part to dispute a single line of it or correct a single date. The source problem deepens from there. Gardner fired Evans in 1988 after learning that Sinatra once sued him for libel and won. That detail hides in no appendix, and the woman at the center of the book ended the collaboration, yet the book appeared anyway decades later, packaged as her secret confessions. A timeline problem sits inside it too. The interviews carry dates spanning 1988 to 1990. The firing lands in 1988. And that arithmetic leaves an open question about which conversations she consented to and which ones arrived reconstructed. Historians who handle this material treat it as contested. The internet treats it as scripture because it quotes well, and because a dying woman confessing eternal love earns more clicks than a dying woman telling a fired journalist to leave her alone. Every viral quote carries a chain of custody, and this particular one carries a hole in it roughly the size of a libel suit that Frank Sinatra won. Check the paperwork before quoting the romance. Then the other source, the one readers trust automatically because her name appears on the cover, Ava. My story arrived from Bantam in 1990, and somewhere inside it Gardner reportedly calls Sinatra the love of her life, a phrase that has anchored nearly every retelling published since. Case closed, according to most retellings, since those count as her own words, except she never published it. Ghostwriters completed the manuscript, and the book reached shelves months after she died on January 25, 1990, of pneumonia in London at 67. She approved no final draft, never saw the arrangement of the material, and never learned which passages somebody sharpened or which of her lines somebody moved into position to carry the emotional weight of an entire book. Historians who work carefully with memoirs flag this exact scenario because a posthumous autobiography functions as a commercial product assembled by people who understand what sells. A Hollywood legend admitting to one great unhealed love sells. A Hollywood legend describing lupus, contract clauses, and an assault on a film set does not. Her own explanation for writing the thing carried no romance whatsoever. She framed it as a choice between the book and the jewels, write or start selling possessions. That describes a woman managing her finances in poor health rather than a woman composing a valentine to somebody in California who had remarried twice by then. Maybe she meant every syllable of the love of my life line. Maybe she murmured something close to it on a bad night, and a ghostwriter recognized a title when he heard one. The honest position admits that nobody can tell, and the entire romantic edifice of this story balances on one uncheckable sentence printed after she lost any ability to object to it. This whole argument comes down to sources, and the pile deserves sorting because the items in it earn wildly different levels of trust. At the top sits Lee Server's Ava Gardner, Love is Nothing, published in 2006 and treated by people who do this professionally as the definitive modern biography, rigorously researched and openly hostile to easy explanations. Server argues that her loneliness grew out of her lifestyle, her personality, and the psychological bill for a rise out of poverty that happened too fast to process. He sells Nobody a Romance, which may explain his absence from thumbnails. Next, John Huston's memoir, An Open Book from 1980, a primary account by a director standing physically present on the set of the Bible, corroborating the violence from George C. Scott. A man writing about something he watched carries more weight than a man writing about something he heard about 30 years afterward. Presence beats hearsay. Then the Bean and Uzarowski volume from 2017, focused on her films rather than her boyfriends, and John Brady's Frank and Ava, In Love and War, from 2015. Solid on its own terms while studying only the relationship. A book about a relationship will, unsurprisingly, conclude that the relationship explains a great deal. That limitation shapes half the material written about her. Below those, the two contested items already covered: a ghostwritten posthumous memoir, and a book built from a fired journalist's notes and published 23 years late. Both sell well. Neither carries her signature. And then the sludge, where most of the internet collects its Ava Gardner facts. Aggregator articles rewriting each other, tabloid content farms, and in one case a citation pointing at an unrelated incident in Peru. Another source turned out to be an artificial intelligence content mill publishing pages time-stamped in the future. That layer manufactures the destitute spinster claim, the paid all her medical bills claim, and the tidy notion that 2 abortions drew a couple closer together instead of tearing them apart. Sorting takes work. The distance between the top of that pile and the bottom equals the distance between what happened and what performs, and most retellings sample from the bottom, because the bottom costs nothing, moves fast, and flatters an audience that arrived wanting a love story rather than a medical history. Two gaps in the record deserve naming, mostly because documentaries about this couple sail straight past them. Nobody knows how often Ava Gardner and Frank Sinatra communicated between the divorce in 1957 and the stroke in 1986. 29 years, and the record stays silent on frequency. He may have telephoned every month, or almost never, picking up only when catastrophe arrived, and no researcher has produced the telephone logs or the archived correspondence that would settle it. Until somebody does, every film describing a constant lifelong connection guesses with confidence. The original unedited audio from the Evans conversations also remains unavailable, which leaves nobody able to determine whether Gardner circled back to Sinatra on her own or whether a journalist with a book to sell kept steering her there. Those two scenarios produce identical transcripts and opposite meanings. Settling either question would redraw the whole picture. Regular contact across those 29 years would support something close to the myth, a bond that outlasted the paperwork and both of his later marriages. Episodic contact, a call after a hospital admission and quiet in between, describes two former spouses behaving the way former spouses generally behave. That distinction decides whether this qualifies as a lifelong romance or a decent man picking up the phone during an emergency, and no film about them yet knows which one applies. Those gaps house the myth. It survives not because evidence supports it, but because evidence stops exactly where the interesting question starts, and a good story always rushes in to fill the silence. So, back to the plane. In 1986, Frank Sinatra paid for a medically staffed flight carrying his ex-wife from London to an American specialist after a stroke took half her mobility. 10 years into his marriage to Barbara Marx, owing her nothing legally or financially, he arranged it anyway. Call that loyalty, because it qualifies, and nothing in this video subtracts it from either of them. Loyalty and a ruined life describe different conditions. Ava Gardner walked out of that marriage in 1953, publicized her own affair, filed her own divorce, bought a house in Madrid before the decree cleared, earned 2 BAFTA nominations and a Golden Globe nomination in the years that followed, survived a violent co-star in 1966, moved to London in 1968, lived with lupus and alcoholism and a stroke, left behind an estate rather than a debt, and wrote a memoir because she preferred writing to selling her jewelry. 33 years of decisions, nearly all of them hers. The title of this video descends from a story assembled after her death, out of a ghostwritten memoir she never approved and a book by a journalist she fired. It survives because saying she never recovered from a man takes less effort than saying she never fully recovered from a studio that priced her pregnancies into a contract, from an industry that discarded her once the contract era ended, from a co-star who used his fists, from an autoimmune disease, and from 30 years of drinking in a foreign city. Simplicity sells. Sinatra explains the least complicated version of her life. He almost never explains the whole one, and the gap between those two accounts covers 33 years, 2 continents, 1 autoimmune disease, and a film set in 1966 that most retellings prefer to skip. She died on January 25, 1990, in London, of pneumonia, at 67, with a memoir at the printers that she never finished. Her name still sits on the cover. Somebody else finished it. Somebody else selected the line about the love of her life, and that line has performed the work of an entire biography ever since. If you want the story of the machine that built her and then dropped her, the one starting with a contract and ending with the studio system in pieces, that video floats around this screen somewhere. Fewer love scenes, considerably more lawyers.